All right, we've talked a lot about the Congress of the United States, and we actually now have someone who has served there, so it's a great pleasure. But it's a great honor to introduce former Senator Jim Webb. He has truly had an incredibly varied career as a public servant in both the executive and the legislative branches. He has a law degree, although he has not been a judge, to my knowledge, so he's not covered all three branches of government. But for my purposes, there are only two things you need to know. One is Senator Webb is a member of the Naval Academy class of 1968, which is fully represented at this podium right now. And all of us in the class have been so proud to see what he's accomplished in just the few years since then. But for the purposes of our gathering here, Senator Webb has had a deep and abiding interest in Southeast Asia from the time he served in Vietnam as a Marine officer, lasting through stints as a reporter. And then when he was in the Senate, he was the chairman of the Southeast Asia Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He has played a personally important role in American policy towards Myanmar, an early advocate of working with Myanmar to make improvements rather than sitting around waiting to help that country. And he maintains his interest to this day. So, Senator Webb, we're privileged to hear you, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today to basically say a few words and perhaps have a conversation if there are people who want to ask me about anything that I don't cover when I speak. There are a lot of people here who have long experience in terms of policy formulation when it comes to Myanmar and other parts of Southeast Asia, and particularly glad to see Professor Steinberg here today. I think he's probably the commentator emeritus in the room, particularly from the time that he started working on these issues, which, as I recall, in 1962, from the times you testified in front of our hearings. He was great help to us when I was in the Senate and when we took the lead in trying to develop a new formula between the United States and Myanmar. I also would like to congratulate the Sasakawa Foundation for taking a leap here and seeing if there aren't ways for Japan and the United States to work together and perhaps create a synergy between the policies of the two countries that can have a lasting impact in Myanmar and in the region. Quite frankly, I think this is very good for the national policies of both countries and also for Myanmar and also for the stability of the region, for us to move forward from the advancements that were made from 2009 when I first led a delegation back into the country. And in that regard, I would also like to say I don't think there could be a better person to be leading the Sasakawa America Foundation than Dennis Blair. He is a classic example of the soldier scholar for many, many years, and I was thinking as I was driving over here today, the first time that I ever had a class at the Naval Academy with Denny Blair. We were among a group that were allowed to, or required to take a foreign language in plebe year rather than a second year. It was a fairly small group of people who had validated certain requirements and were moved ahead. And they told me I had to take a language, and I hadn't studied any of the regular languages in high school, Spanish, German, whatever it was. So I took a competitive look around and I said, if I go in there and take Spanish or one of these other languages, these people have had 4 years of it, I'm going to get demolished, so I'll take Russian. And I went into Russian class. There were 7 of us in the class, and they were like the 6 smartest people in the class of 1968 and me. So we get to the third class period, and I'm still trying to figure out the Russian alphabet, and Denny Blair announces that he can now think in Russian. And we got to our final year, and one of my best friends, who was Russian, was getting married, and he asked if I would be his best man, and I'm thinking, you know, his mother's coming, I want to give this toast in Russian, so I looked up Denny, and I actually still remember what he taught me. He taught me this toast in Russian, but when I gave it, my friend's mother thought I was speaking Latin. I did a little better in Vietnamese later on. I had more incentive to learn the language at that time. My strong interest in changing the formula in Myanmar actually began in 2001, in April of 2001, when I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal about United States interests in Asia and the expansionist policies of China that were not being properly answered, not just on a military sense, but in a diplomatic, a commercial, a cultural sense in the region. And after I wrote this article, I got a letter from an American businessman who was doing business in Myanmar, and he said, if you want to come to a place where Chinese expansionism meets American negligence, come visit me. And I was spending a good bit of time in the 90s into the early part of this century in Asia, in East Asia. I was on my way to a trip to Vietnam and Thailand, and so I took him up on it. I went into Myanmar and I spent a good bit of time with him. His name was Chris Kingsley, for those of you who may know him, and looked at the impact of American policies from the perspective of someone who was trying to do some good in the face of sanctions and more sanctions that were coming. And, you know, he probably at that time had the finest outdoor furniture business in the world. And he was building it with Burmese assistants, training them and the business concepts. He'd spent 8 years. He also had a business in Indonesia, but he'd spent 8 years putting this business together, exporting very high quality furniture. And he took me around to his different plants, out to meet different people, and I actually met some government people at the time as well. And his point to me in 2001 was, you know something? When the sanctions come in 2003, I'm going to be gone. But what good is that doing the United States interests in this country? And it was a valid point. I had just spent about 10 years working, from the time I began working with post-war Vietnam, with their situation. When I first started returning to Vietnam in 1991, it was a Stalinist state. A lot of Americans missed the bamboo curtain, what was really going on behind the bamboo curtain in Vietnam before things began changing. And I had worked hard from 1991 forward inside Vietnam, and from much earlier than that here with the Vietnamese community in the United States, to try to find a formula where we could build a bridge between, at that time, the million Vietnamese who, including my wife's family, by the way, who had escaped from Vietnam when the communists took over, and trying to find a formula where we could reestablish relations, encourage in the incremental way that is so characteristic of East Asia, the relaxation of policies and the change in governmental systems that can accompany a greater presence from the outside world. And so from 2001 forward, when I was able to, I would speak about the situation in Myanmar and express my belief, as I had learned in Vietnam, by the way. I didn't, when I say I had learned, I did not come into Vietnam in 1991-92 thinking that we had to lift sanctions in Vietnam. I have a very strong relationship with the people, the Vietnamese who were with us on the battlefield, who had been thrown into re-education camps, 1 million of them thrown into re-education camps and endured a lot of hardships. But we learned, I learned personally from 1994 when we lifted sanctions, how you can affect the well-being and the policies, the well-being of people on the street and the policies of the government if you engage and if you do it in the right sort of way. When I came to the Senate in '07, I started talking about how we might reach out to the military junta in Myanmar and to have a dialogue, to reestablish a dialogue. We worked on this all the way from early '07 into '09 when I finally was given a visa and we took our mission into Naypyidaw. It was quite a story because when we started hearing back from representatives of the government who had listened not only to us, but to what I would call validators. By the way, there was not a lot of excitement in the United States State Department about what I was trying to do in '07 and '08. In fact, I think if we were relying on the State Department to get our visas, we would still be waiting. But we had validators like Chris Kingsley and like Myint Tant, who has done so much to try to move things forward. And so for about 7 months, we were in serious negotiations with the junta about allowing a trip in meetings. They had not met with an American leader for 10 years. They had not entertained an American delegation for 10 years. No American had ever met with General Tan Shui. He had refused to ever meet with an American leader. And so finally, in the summer of '09, we were able to make this trip. And some of you will remember, right, not too long before we made the trip, there was an American named John Yetta who believed that if he could fashion a pair of wooden paddles on his feet, he could swim through this lake and save Aung San Suu Kyi, and had been caught in the lake and was incarcerated, and they didn't quite know what to do with him. But it was when I got into the country, it was a very visible issue. So we went in, we had the meetings. My message was, one thing that I will always say in any East Asian country is, I will not tell you what I think you ought to do. I will tell you from an observer standpoint from the outside what would be beneficial if you do it. But I don't, in the Asian cultures, I don't know many Asian cultures that like to be told what to do. And I did not want to start off a new relationship with that principle. We were listened to. Those of you who remember what had happened with the junta over the years will also recall that it had become more and more remote as the country had become more and more remote. When we were looking at the membership and over time, we saw that the membership in the junta had actually shrunk when people left. They weren't bringing new officers in, even from the top levels of the Myanmar military, with rare exceptions. So we made the journey. It was kind of interesting landing in Naypyidaw. As you know, they had built it in the middle of nowhere, and we were landing an American C-12, and we landed in Naypyidaw, and there wasn't even a gas pump to refill the aircraft over there. It was still, you know, as my wife looked out and said, if you build it, they will come to build it. It was pretty eerie, the very first visit, and it's kind of, in my mind, it makes me recall the journey, and I think the positive side of the journey. From that trip, we were also able to have a meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi. It's a private meeting, and I remember afterwards there were a lot of people trying to characterize what was said in the meeting, and I refused to do that. And the reason I refused to do that was that she was under political arrest, and she did not have the opportunity to respond to anything that I would have said, and out of respect for her, I mean, it was a good meeting, but out of respect for her, I did not think it was proper for me to characterize a conversation, which obviously with the people who didn't want us to be doing this led to some suspicion that there had been something said in the meeting that was negative, and there was not. We also, when we left, had to deal with Mr. Yetta, and actually when I met with the leaders of the junta, I said, you know, look, why don't we just take him off your hands? He's ill, you know, he doesn't need to be in prison, and I think they couldn't have jumped fast enough. They were looking for a way for us to take him back. He had a seizure that morning, and when we were getting ready to get on the plane, and everyone was afraid they weren't going to be able to put him on the plane, actually. But we had a medical assistance, and we did bring him out, and you know, I hope he's doing well at this time. The other thing that happened is when we got out after this trip, when we got to Bangkok, there was a huge press corps. There was a lot of curiosity with what had happened, and there were then, and there are now, skeptics. They deserve to be skeptical, particularly in our system. The very first question I got was from a reporter from the Washington Post and Financial Times. He said, how can you go in and support the change, you know, the change in a system where they're going to have elections in a year, and we know that 25% of the people are going to be military anyway. We know that the military wants to, you know, to maintain control. How can you stand up there and say you support that when you live in a democracy? And my answer was, when is the last time China had an election? When is the last time China allowed an opposition party? The answer is, whatever it was before 1949. And the same with Vietnam. As much as I have worked with Vietnam and worked with the government, and I have good friends in the government, there's no opposition party in Vietnam. There are no elections in Vietnam. So we understand this region, change comes incrementally. And it comes through the building of trust, and it also comes from the encouragement of people such as our government and the Japanese government, and working together, hopefully, to continue to incentivize change. After I came back, we began congressional hearings, which Professor Steinberg was one of the most valuable witnesses with his long experience in the region. We continued to reach out to intermediaries, and we began seeing visiting delegations from the government. And we're in a very good place right now, in my view. And frankly, I think there are two heroes when we look at the journey that we're now on. The first is Aung San Suu Kyi. She, I believe, is a very fine political leader. I think people tend to think of her as an icon. When those of you who are going to visit the Senate, as I hear this week there will be a visit to the Senate, you'll know that Mitch McConnell keeps a picture of Aung San Suu Kyi on his wall in his office. But she, I think, has extended herself beyond that role of a Nobel laureate icon. I was very impressed with her when she visited our country in 2012, when she did not take the bait about the hardship years and the junta, and she could have come in here and really taken a political vengeance, but she was looking to the future and saying, now is the time, let's move to the future and trying to do it the right way. The other hero, in my view, is Thein Sein, President Thein Sein. He's not given the credit that he deserves, in my opinion. He, along with her, moved these things forward. He was a totally different background. Aung San Suu Kyi came from one of the great families, educated outside the country, etc. Thein Sein grew up in a small town that the last time I checked, when I was visiting Myanmar, probably about a year and a half ago, still had dirt roads, still didn't even have paved roads. He made a life as a soldier. I respect that. I made my life as a soldier. And he took a number of risks, I think, to try to move the political process forward. So I'm an optimist. I hope that our government will move forward in terms of its economic policies, lift some of these restrictions. If you're a strong business organization, you can't afford to take the risk every single year that your business might suffer the consequences that Christopher Kingsley's business suffered in '03. Confidence building gestures are so important from organizations such as Sasakawa, working together. And as I said, I think the well-being of the region, the national interests of Japan and the United States and of Myanmar will be well served. The stronger and more diverse the economy, the more we encourage that government to move toward democratic systems and to allow true opposition parties and political dissent. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Let's see, while the microphones are coming in for questions from the audience, let me, if I may ask the first one. At lunch, Ambassador Mitchell told us that in the old days, it was possible to have a very simple narrative about Myanmar, the good Aung San Suu Kyi, the bad junta. There were no penalties to taking a simplistic view from the American point of view, but what he emphasized is the complexity of the situation now with so many parts of society, government, the economic scene in play, and that the old simple formulas just are breaking down, and to have a set of, he didn't say this because he can't obviously, but to have a set of sanctions which are sort of leftovers from the old regime rather than trying to help the right people and don't help the wrong people in that country would be a much more appropriate way for both the United States and Japan to approach assistance to Myanmar. I wonder if you could give us any practical advice how we could get that message more widely known, both among the public, those who take an interest on Capitol Hill, and is it just something we just have to keep our legs moving and keep moving forward, or are there some places that you would recommend that we really push?
Well, I think that when you have the situations like you had in Vietnam and you have in Burma, and I know that there were a lot of people in the overseas community here from the Burmese side were not happy when I made this first visit. They were entrenched in a justifiable resentment of a military junta, and in many cases had lost their livelihood inside the country as a result. One of the first hearings we had, I think Professor Steinberg may mention this, a bunch of them walked in and wore T-shirts that said, "Burma is not Vietnam." Well, that's true, but there are cycles that take place when you have this sort of skepticism, in many cases deserved skepticism, over a long period of time. And I'm saying this because I think this is a big part of where the answer could be with respect to Myanmar. But you see it with respect to Cuba. It's been 50 years. We finally said we can go visit Cuba. We saw it with respect to Vietnam. I was a part of the group of people here who fought on the ground against the communist takeover. I was wounded. I came back with a very strong belief that what we were attempting to do in Vietnam was correct. We just saw a couple of days ago the passing of Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, who I think was one of the great minds of the last 100 years, economically and politically, who would say over and over again that the American effort in Vietnam enabled Southeast Asia to adjust to a post-colonial world when so many of the European colonial powers had left after World War II and Japan had receded back into the Japanese boundaries. And as a result, we had allowed economic systems to grow and governmental systems to begin to change. So it was hard. I agree with him, by the way. I always appreciated him saying that as a great mind in Southeast Asia. But it was very difficult working with the Vietnamese community and working with my fellow Vietnam veterans to say, yeah, okay, well, now we need to go in there, we need to talk to these people, and all the things that we believed in when we fought there, we still need to work on it, and we need to develop a dialogue and to try to move their system politically, philosophically, into a more open system of government. And we worked on that. Actually, this is interesting given the Sasakawa Foundation, because the final moment for me in terms of sanction in Vietnam was when Japan decided to lift their sanctions in 1993. And I said, well, if Japan is lifting its sanctions, there's no sense for us to maintain them. And we moved forward. I brought American companies into Vietnam for 2.5 years at one point after sanctions were lifted. And the effort that I've made there since then is to bring the Vietnamese community in the United States into the formula, into the political formula. And we've been seeing that very, very slowly, but we have been seeing that. And the same thing I think is true when you look at Myanmar. I was listening to Admiral Blair just before I came on. He was talking about there are representatives here who are now working inside Myanmar who were expatriates after 1988 and who are bringing valuable knowledge back into the country. This is a country whose educational systems grew as remote as the junta I was just describing. And the long-term answer is for us to begin to bring value into Myanmar, economic value, political thought. I think I have been impressed working with the government, the Burmese government, listening to the questions that they were asking there and here during the time of the Senate and during my return visit after I left the Senate. They were saying, how do we do this? You know, they weren't, the Vietnamese, you know, the communists don't say that. And they don't say, how do we become more democratic? They say, how can we get along? How can we move forward? But I was hearing, how do we develop a democratic system? What do we do? And the answer in many cases is from the people who were forced to leave and who are now going back to help make it the place that they wanted it to be.
I think that's it. Yes, Mary? Do we have a microphone that we can...
If you'd like, I can just repeat your question.
Senator Webb, I've been academic, have been working in Myanmar for 25 years. And have been on leave to spend the last couple of years in Yangon. And one of the things I've noticed over the last 2.5 decades is that the appetite for bad news about Burma or Myanmar is insatiable here inside the Beltway. And the interest in nuance is exactly the opposite. And so I just wonder, is this a fact of life? We're going into 2 very complex campaign seasons. First of all, the campaign in Myanmar leading up to the November election, and then a presidential campaign here in the United States. And it strikes me that nuance is probably not going to play well going forward.
Well, our political system, particularly during campaign season, isn't really known for nuance either. I would just start by saying that. If you can't get into that 15-second ad, you're in trouble. But I know exactly what you're saying, and it's true with respect to the situation in Vietnam. It's true with respect to the emotional reaction among Cuban Americans when we hopefully started moving forward there. It's really emotional in the Vietnamese community. If you go out to Eden Center and Falls Church, people ever eat there, you know, they still fly the South Vietnamese flag, and they had a really violent scene a few years ago when an individual drank too much and went out and urinated on the flagpole. I mean, you know, just that kind of emotion is in people, and I know it's also in this community. And I think if people believe that they are included, everybody's going to have their political views, but if they believe they are included in the betterment and have a stake in seeing things get better, then that's a big part of it. But there are people who are not going to lose that, and you can respect what they went through and make sure that what they went through continues to be respected, even though we're moving to a different place. Yes, sir.
Yeah, James.
I think it's on. My name is Jim Schoaf. I'm from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And picking up on that question, I wanted to ask your opinion about how malleable opinion or attitudes in Congress are towards Myanmar and this issue and its transition. In other words, is it worthwhile putting effort into exchanges in education and trying to broaden the understanding of nuance, and or is that almost a lost cause given the amount of time that's and the people who are focused on it?
By the way, please give my regards to Secretary Barnes, who was a great diplomat. He was you're lucky to get him. He is really the best diplomat I think we had during my time in the Senate. I think the world of him. Minds can be changed. You know, the number one rule, I think, for leadership, and particularly in these kinds of areas where you're moving into the unknowns, is you have to be able to stand up and speak clearly and take the hits. I think we did this with the Myanmar issue. We also, I'm very proud to say, did it with respect to criminal justice reform in the United States. When I first started talking about mass incarceration and how broken our criminal justice system was, Democrats were coming up to me and they were saying, you are committing political suicide by saying we got too many people in jail. And we stayed at it for 2.5 years, and developed a piece of legislation that eventually did not pass. It got 57 votes, but which even the National Review editorialized it being insane to vote against this thing. And we did changed the whole discussion. We brought that issue out of the shadows. And I think if you just look at where we are now with respect to the invigoration of the relationship between the United States and Myanmar, and not just the United States. We had people coming after the visit, and the fact that we were continuing to push this with hearings and meetings, et cetera. We had people coming to have discussions with us in my office from the EU, from Australia, from the UK, from Singapore. How should we shape our policy? What can we do? So if you have something that you believe in and is logical, you take the hits and move forward, and you can change minds. And this is one, it's especially affected in the Congress because of the journey of Aung San Suu Kyi. It, in many people's minds, was personalized, and it's kind of difficult for them to turn around into a new direction. But I think she did a very effective job when she came here and personally spoke to some of the leaders who, as I said, wanted her to take a free shot, and she did not. So emphasize where this needs to go, what has happened just since '09, really, what has happened, and what the potential could be.
Let's see, right at this table, sir.
Say, hey, Mike, how are you?
Let me ask you the question everybody in this room is dying to ask.
This is about Myanmar.
We're going to be hearing you saying these kind of things in Iowa and New Hampshire.
Well, I'm going to Thailand on Friday at the invitation of their government, and the historic crisis that Thailand is undergoing right now, and very low-key in the international media because of obvious reasons in terms of lèse majesty laws and those sorts of things. But I'm very interested to go there, and they're hosting me just to sit down and talk with their leadership about how to unwind these sorts of things. But to answer your question, when I get back, I will be in Iowa, and I'm happy to talk about this wherever I go.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Yeah.
All right, you learn at the Naval Academy, speak clearly and take the hits. So keep going, Senator. We'll take a short break before the next panel.